I work in the cold. That is not a metaphor, though the Vethana conclave of records has its metaphors too, and I have had 4 decades to learn them all. I mean it literally. The Tier 7 restricted stacks are maintained at a temperature 4 degrees below the atmospheric standard of this station, because the preservation chemistry of sealed documentation requires it. Cold seeps into the joints. It dulls the fingertips after the 3rd hour. By the 6th hour of an extended review session, it becomes something more personal than discomfort. It becomes a presence, a thin, patient thing that sits alongside you in the archive and waits for you to finish. I have grown over time to appreciate it. An archive is not a living place. The conclave's senior adjudicators, those who manage the cataloging floors and the public reference halls on Tiers 1 through 3, sometimes speak of their work with a warmth that puzzles me. They use words like stewardship. They speak of the living record. They invite junior archivists to think of documentation as a kind of breathing organism, evidence that the conclave grows, adapts, remembers, that the knowledge we keep is not inert, but alive in some meaningful sense, waiting to be found. I understand the philosophy. I do not share it. What I keep in Tier 7 does not breathe. It does not wait to be found. Much of it was sealed with explicit instructions that it never be found, or at least never be found easily, never be found accidentally, never found by anyone who did not first know to look and then demonstrate sufficient cause to the conclave's senior review panel for 4 consecutive review cycles. The material in Tier 7 was placed there by people and institutions that understood, with unusual clarity, that certain information does more damage loose in the world than locked inside a vault. I am the 3rd archivist to hold this posting in the conclave's recent history. The first held it for 6 years before requesting reassignment. She never publicly stated her reasons. The second held it for 19 years and retired at mandatory age, with a commendation he never collected. I have been here for 38 years. I am not young. I am not particularly well. The cold has settled into my secondary joints in a way my physician describes, with professional restraint, as progressive. Do not plan to request reassignment. The Tier 7 stacks contain, at present count, 9,417 sealed incident files. Of those, 8,000 and some are administrative closures, disciplinary records, suppressed jurisdictional disputes, internal audits of conclave operations that the concs determined were nobody else's business. 612 are political seals. Documents that one or more galactic governing bodies requested the conclave hold under restricted access, reasons the conclave itself was not required to know. 109 are what I privately call the deep files, sealed not because their contents are embarrassing or politically inconvenient, but because their contents are the kind of thing that changes the behavior of anyone who reads them and the conclave. After consultation with parties whose names are themselves restricted, determined that the behavioral change was not, on balance, a contribution to galactic stability. And then there is File Veth 714. File Veth 714 has its own shelf. Not because it is the oldest file in my care. It is not. Not because it is the most politically sensitive. Arguably 3 others in the 600s exceed it on that measure. It has its own shelf, because when the file was delivered to my predecessor, 19 years before my appointment, it arrived with an unusual instruction. The file was not to be shelved among other files. It was not to share physical proximity with adjacent documentation in a way that might invite casual comparison. It was to stand alone, sufficient space on either side, that no one reaching for a neighboring folder would brush its edge by accident. Predecessor passed this instruction to me verbally on my first day. I asked him where the written directive was. He told me there was no written directive. He told me he was passing it on as a professional courtesy from one archivist to the next. He told me he thought I would understand when I read the file. He was correct. I have read File Veth 714 11 times over the course of my tenure. I do not read it on schedule. I do not read it for research or for any cataloging purpose. I read it because every 7 or 8 years something happens in the wider galaxy. A new governing compact announces its intentions. A young fleet command publishes a strategic doctrine with a particular kind of confidence in its language. A delegation from a species that has been in isolation for 2 or 3 generations emerges with an agenda that suggests they have certain things that older species prefer not to forget. And when this happens, I go to the shelf where Veth 714 stands alone, and I read it again, and I sit with the cold for a while afterward. Let me tell you what the file contains. The Brethian Governing Compact, and I use the past tense deliberately, because the compact no longer exists as it did when this record was created, was, at the time of these events, one of the more ambitious political formations in its region of the settled galaxy. Ambitious is the diplomatic term. The word I would use, reviewing their internal documentation, is certain. Green. They were a compact that had achieved a great deal over 2 centuries of expansion and political consolidation, and what they had achieved had taught them lessons about the nature of galactic power that were, in the context of their own history, entirely correct. They had learned that decisive action was rewarded, that hesitation was exploited, that the willingness to apply force, not clumsily, not brutally, but precisely and early, was the thing that separated governing bodies that persisted from governing bodies that were eventually absorbed by ones that understood this better. They were not wrong about any of this. Their own history bore it out. The difficulty was that they had also, over those same 2 centuries, developed a considered and well-documented position on the question of humanity. The position was not unique to them. I want to be precise about this, because I think precision matters when I say it. The Brethian Compact's position on humanity was not the position of a body that had studied the question carefully and reached a heterodox conclusion. It was the position of a body that had not studied the question at all, and that had therefore arrived, through pure intellectual momentum, at a conclusion that felt to them like common sense. The position was, approximately this: the prohibitions and warnings and formal avoidance designations surrounding human space were the accumulated superstitions of older, more fearful species. Species that had encountered humanity at a particular historical moment, probably a moment of early expansion, probably a moment before humanity had been properly contextualized within the galactic order, and had reacted with disproportionate alarm. That the alarm had calcified over time into doctrine was not evidence that the doctrine was correct. It was evidence that fear, left unchallenged, became tradition, and tradition, in the Compact's considered view, was the enemy of accurate strategic assessment. They had committed this position to writing. It appears, in summary form, in approximately 40 internal documents spanning 11 years before the events in question. I have read all 40. The language is consistent across the period. Measured, analytical, occasionally impatient, with what the authors clearly regarded as galactic, community groupthink. There are passages that, read outside their context, I might find persuasive. The Compact's strategic theorists were not unintelligent. They were simply working from an incomplete dataset, and had, structural reasons I have come to understand over many years in this role, no mechanism to correct it. The incomplete dataset was this: they had never spoken to anyone who had been on the other side of the line. There are not many such individuals in the galaxy. The number is not 0, but the individuals who exist tend to have qualities that make them poor sources for a strategic assessment document. They do not interview well. Several of them do not communicate in standard form anymore. Their responses to structured inquiry tend to fall outside the parameters that assessment methodologies are designed to handle, not because the methodologies are poorly designed, but because the methodologies were designed for a range of experiences that does not include whatever these individuals experienced. 2 of the most significant cases in the archive's holdings communicated exclusively in what their respective physicians described as vocalization without referential content, sound produced by living organisms that has shed its connection to meaning. One of those 2 recovered, partially, over 7 years of treatment. The other did not. The Compact's theorists would have said, if presented with this information, that these were outlier cases. That the individuals in question had encountered something specific and terrible that did not represent humanity in general. That the appropriate response to outlier cases was not to revise the doctrine, but to contextualize the cases within a more rigorous analytical framework. They would have been doing what intelligent beings do when the evidence contradicts what they have already decided is true. I am not judging them for this. I have spent 38 years in a cold vault, reading the documentation of decisions made by beings who were doing their best with the information available to them, filtered through the cognitive habits their respective cultures had built over generations. The Vrethian Compact's theorists were smarter than average. That made them better at the thing intelligence is often best at, constructing coherent arguments for conclusions already reached. The Solvith Neutral Corridor. I need to explain the corridor because it is the geographic fact around which everything else in the file is organized. The Solvith Neutral Corridor is a transit lane, approximately 4 light-years in length and less than 1 in width at its narrowest point, that runs between 2 regions of administered galactic space in the sector the Compact claimed as its sphere of influence. It is called neutral because it was designated as such by the Yethsovan Trade Accords of roughly 400 years ago. A designation that meant, in practical terms, that no single governing body owned it, that transit through it was available to any registered vessel, regardless of political affiliation, and that no military installation could be placed within its boundaries without unanimous consent of the Accord's signatories. It was a corridor that several governing bodies wanted very much to control, because what it connected on either end was a source of economic leverage that I will not detail here, except to say that the species who held effective influence over the corridor's traffic had historically been in a strong negotiating position with everyone else. The Compact wanted that leverage. They had wanted it for some time. The various diplomatic mechanisms by which they had attempted to acquire it had not, over the preceding decade, produced the outcome they sought. The other governing bodies in the region were aware of the Compact's ambitions and had been, with varying degrees of success, aligned in resisting them. This is the context in which the Compact made the decision that file Veth 714 documents. There was a ceremonial occasion. I will call it what the Compact's own records called it, the ratification assembly of the 7th Solvith Economic Agreement. It was a formal meeting of all regional governing bodies with interests in the corridor convened to ratify an updated set of trade protocols. It was the kind of event at which the attending delegations brought, along with their negotiators and their legal advisors, a certain number of what the diplomatic vocabulary of that region called attendant staff, individuals present not in any official negotiating capacity, but as part of the broader institutional presence each delegation projected: aides, protocol officers, security personnel in formal rather than tactical configurations, the kind of individuals whose presence at an event said, "We are a substantial and well-organized governing body," without saying anything specific. Each delegation was permitted to bring attendant staff up to a designated number. The Compact's full allocation was 12. They brought 11. 12th position in their attendant staff allocation was filled by a human. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I think it is the kind full sentence that reads as mundane on first encounter, and reveals its weight only on reflection. They brought 11 members of their own species as attendant staff, and they filled the 12th position with a human. Not a human diplomat, not a human political observer, not a human in any official capacity that would have required registration with the Assembly's organizing body or disclosure on the standard attendant staff manifest, a human attendant, formally documented as staff, occupying the same category in the Assembly's records as the aides and protocol officers in the 11 positions alongside. I have spent a considerable amount of time over the course of my 11 readings of this file, thinking about why the Compact made this choice. There is internal documentation that explains their reasoning, and I will get to it. But I want first to explain what it looked like from the outside, because the outside perspective is what the file was ultimately assembled to document. From the outside, it looked like this. The Vrethian Governing Compact, which was known to have settled and documented positions, skeptical of galactic community warnings about humanity, brought a human being to a major regional diplomatic assembly. Not as a statement of alliance, not as a demonstration of diplomatic partnership, as an attendant, as staff. The other delegations at the CC understood immediately what was being communicated. I know this, because the file contains their communications from that period, several of which were intercepted, and several of which were shared voluntarily with the conclave's investigators afterward, in the way that institutions share documentation. When they want to establish that they understood something important before anyone else admitted, they understood it. The other delegations understood that the compact was not making a diplomatic argument. They were making a contempt argument. They were saying, in the language of gesture, that governing bodies have always used alongside the language of formal negotiation, we do not share your fear of this category of being. We regard your fear as the superstition we have always called it, and we are demonstrating our lack of fear by treating a representative of the thing you fear as a functionary, as staff, as the person who carries the documents and refills the water vessels, and stands at the back of the room during the formal proceedings. The other delegations did not protest this publicly. Several of them, in their private communications, expressed something that I would characterize, translating across significant species and cultural barriers, as a mixture of alarm and a kind of exhausted, watching patience. The kind of patience that is not quite the same as calm, the kind of patience that knows something is coming, and has accepted that it cannot be stopped by anything short of the event itself arriving and doing its work. The human was given a name in the compact's official documentation. I will not reproduce it here. It was a standard attendant registration, the kind of name plus identifier that the Assembly's organizing body required for all staff-level participants. The file does not contain a physical description in any format I could analyze. It does not contain a record of the human's conduct during the Assembly's formal sessions. What it contains, regarding the human's presence during the Assembly itself, is an almost total absence of documentation, which, I have learned, is itself a kind of documentation. The absence means no one thought to record anything remarkable. The human was, during the Assembly's formal proceedings, unremarkable. This is where the internal compact documentation becomes interesting. The compact's internal rationale for this decision, bringing a human attendant, was, as I said, extensively documented. 40 documents, 11 years. But the specific justification for this specific choice, at this specific assembly, was articulated in a briefing paper, prepared by the compact's Strategic Assessment Division, approximately 6 weeks before the event. I have read the paper many times. It is well written. It reflects, as I said, a certain kind of intelligence applied with real discipline to the problem of galactic community dynamics. The argument was this. The Solvith Neutral Corridor negotiations had reached a point of stasis. The other governing bodies were aligned in a coalition of resistance that the compact's conventional diplomatic tools could not break. The coalition was held together not purely by shared economic interest. Interests that were, in truth, somewhat divergent across its members, some of whom had been persuaded to join more by diplomatic pressure than by any calculation of their own advantage, but by shared apprehension. The compact had correctly identified that the coalition's coherence depended on a kind of ambient anxiety about what an aggressive compact might do. If the compact could demonstrate, in a visible and public way, that it did not share the galaxy's larger apprehensions about human space, that it guarded those apprehensions as unfounded, and the species that maintained them as prisoners of outdated reflex, it would be signaling to the coalition members a particular quality of resolve. An absence of the fear that most governing bodies carried as an invisible weight across every strategic calculation they made. A willingness to treat as ordinary what others treated as taboo. Briefing paper named 3 specific coalition members whose strategic alignment was assessed as fragile, and noted that all 3 shared, in the paper's language, a disproportionate historic weighting of avoidance doctrine relative to demonstrable threat. Which is to say, they feared humans more than the compact believed the evidence warranted. And this fear was, according to the paper's analysis, a meaningful part of why they remained in a coalition that was costing them something in other areas. Dislodge the fear, the paper argued, and the coalition's internal economics might shift. The theory was that this signal would be destabilizing to the coalition in a useful way. Several of the coalition members were species with long memories of the events that had produced the avoidance designations around human space. If the compact demonstrated that it placed no weight on those memories, some of those members might recalibrate, might decide that alignment with a compact willing to make that demonstration was more valuable than alignment with bodies that still organize their strategic behavior around fears. Their grandparents' had inherited from species older than any of them. It was, as strategic theories go, not unreasonable. It rested on a set of assumptions that were coherent given what the compact knew. The problem with those assumptions is the problem I have spent 38 years in a cold room cataloging. They were about a variable the compact had never directly measured. The human did not appear to find any of this objectionable. This detail appears in the file only in passing in a note from the compact's senior protocol officer, recorded that the human attendant had been briefed on the arrangement and had responded in a way the protocol officer described as without significant objection. I have thought about that phrase. Without significant objection is not the same as with enthusiasm. It is not the same with understanding. It is a protocol officer's notation that they discharge their information duty, and the subject's response did not require them to take any further action. The assembly proceeded. The formal sessions occurred. The ratification proceedings advanced through their scheduled stages. The human stood where attendant staff stood, and did what attendant staff did, and did not, in the compact's own records, distinguish themselves from any of the 11 Vrethian attendants in any way the compact saw fit to document. On the fourth day of the assembly there was an incident. I use the word incident because the compact's records use it. The word is doing a great deal of work in that context, because what the compact was documenting as an incident was a thing that required 9 separate internal reports and a classified supplemental inquiry that took 4 months to complete. The word incident in bureaucratic language often means a thing occurred that we did not anticipate and cannot fully explain and have decided to treat as bounded and contained, even though we are not certain it is either of those things. I will tell you what the file documents without telling you more than the file contains. I am an archivist. I record what is in the record. Speculation is not my function. On the fourth day of the assembly, the Solvith Neutral Corridor, which runs, as I said, between 2 regions of administered space, and which is 4 light years in length and traversable, in standard transit, in approximately 9 days, became unavailable for transit. Not in the sense that access was blocked by a military or administrative action, not in the sense that some physical catastrophe had made the corridor impassable. The corridor became unavailable in the precise sense that no vessel that entered it during the period in question emerged from the other end. Communications into the corridor were not returned. Probes dispatched by the Assembly's monitoring authority were not returned. The corridor existed, physically intact, as it had existed for 4 centuries. It simply stopped being a thing that ships passed through. The period during which the corridor was unavailable lasted 11 days. I want to be precise about that number, because precision is what I have. 11 days. Not 9, which would have been within the range of an unusually slow standard transit. Not 3, which might have suggested a communication failure. 11 days, during which the Vrethian Compact's senior diplomatic staff at the Assembly proceeded through the ratification sessions with a quality of focus that their counterparts later described. In the testimony, the conclave's investigators collected as unusual. Distracted was another word used. One senior delegate from one of the coalition members used the word haunted, which is a strong word in their species vocabulary, and which that delegate, when asked to clarify, declined to expand upon. The human attendant was not present at the assembly during those 11 days. I want to be clear about the documentation here. The human was not recorded as absent. They were not noted in the compact's logs as missing or unaccounted for. The compact's internal records from those 11 days contain, regarding the human attendant, the same quality of absence that characterized the human's documentation throughout the assembly. A non-notation that, in context, means something different from what it would mean if extracted from that context. An archivist learns to read the difference. What the absence in those 11 days means in context is that the compact's record keepers were not noting the human, because noting the human would have required them to note where the human was. And noting where the human was not something the compact was prepared to do in a document that might be reviewed. On the 11th day, the corridor was traversable again. The compact's survey vessels, which had been holding position at the corridor's entrance for 9 of those 11 days, having been dispatched on day 2, when it became apparent that the situation was not resolving through inaction, entered the corridor and transited to the far end. Their report was sealed within 6 hours of its receipt by the compact's senior command staff. That sealed report is part of File Veth 714. I have read it. I am not going to reproduce its specific contents here, because the specific contents are the kind of thing the file was sealed to protect. Protect in the direction of not distributing, not in the direction of hiding from official scrutiny. The conclave knows what the report contains. I know what it contains. Several individuals who are no longer living knew what it contained. The seal exists because the conclave determined, in consultation with the parties I mentioned earlier, that the report's specific contents constituted the kind of information that does more damage, loose than locked. What I will tell you is what the sealed report documented in general terms, because the general terms are what the compact itself circulated internally in the days following. In appropriately cautious language, circulated nonetheless. Because the compact was an institution that ran on information, and its senior officers needed some version of the truth, function. The corridor was intact. Structurally, physically, instrumentally intact. Nothing in the corridor had been destroyed. The corridor's own infrastructure, the navigational beacons, the emergency relay stations, the monitoring equipment the Assembly's transit authority maintained at 4 points along its length, was present and functional. The survey vessels found all of it, exactly where it was supposed to be, and operating within normal parameters. What the corridor did not contain was anyone else. That is not an unusual finding in itself. Corridor, during an 11-day access disruption, would not be expected to contain routine transit traffic, but the survey vessels had been looking for specific things. Specific vessels, specifically. The compact's own communications drones that had been dispatched during the disruption period, specifically the monitoring probes sent by the Assembly Authority, specifically any physical evidence of what had caused the disruption and why it had resolved. They found none of these things. The drones were gone. The probes were gone. The evidence of the disruption's mechanism was gone. What the corridor contained when the survey vessels transited it was empty space and functional infrastructure and nothing else. The survey vessel's captain filed a supplemental notation, appended to the sealed report, which I will quote in part, because I think the specific language is relevant and the quote is brief. And from a primary source I am authorized to reference. The captain wrote, "The corridor presents no anomaly detectable by our instruments. It presents as a corridor in which nothing has occurred. The monitoring logs from the Transit Authority's relay stations record all vessel movement within the corridor, contain no entries for the 11-day disruption period. Not incomplete entries. Not corrupted entries. No entries. The relay stations were recording. They contain no record of what they recorded." The captain added one further sentence, and then apparently thought better of it because the sentence is struck through in the original document. I have, of course, reads the struck through sentence because a struck through sentence in a sealed report is not a redaction. It is the record of a decision to retract, which is its own form of documentation. I will not quote it directly, but I will say that the captain was expressing, in personal and professional terms, a wish that they had been assigned to a different survey task on a different day. The human attendant returned to the compact's delegation on the 11th day. The return is documented in a single line in the compact's senior staff log. In the handwriting of the compact's chief of protocol, was responsible for delegation manifest tracking. The line reads, "Attendant identifier returned to delegation, 14th hour mark, condition unremarkable, no medical intervention required." I have spent a long time with that notation. Condition unremarkable is protocol language. For I examined the individual and found nothing that required me to take action. It is not the same as appeared unchanged. It is not the same as was as they had been before. It is the notation of a trained protocol officer who had examined a returning staff member and found nothing that the officer's training and available instruments could categorize as a condition requiring action. In the margin beside that notation, in different handwriting, smaller, less formal, with the slightly uneven pressure of someone writing quickly or under some form of stress, are 4 words that I believe were added by Chief of Protocol themselves at some point after the original entry. I believe this because the handwriting, though different in quality, has characteristics consistent with the same individual. The 4 words are, did not ask, good. The Chief of Protocol retired from service 8 months after the assembly. They took an early retirement, at a point in their career when retirement was available, but by the standard progression of their role, not expected. There is no documentation in the Compact's records of the reason. There is a small notation from the Compact's Personnel Administration Office that reads, personal grounds, approved without review, which is the notation used when a reviewing authority has accepted a retirement request without requiring the applicant to provide a more specific justification. The reviewing authority in this case was the Compact's first secretary. The first secretary approved the request within 1 day of its submission. Under normal administrative timelines, approval of a retirement request typically required between 12 and 20 days. The Assembly's ratification proceedings were completed on the 15th day. The 7th Solvith Economic Agreement was ratified by all parties except the Vrethian Governing Compact, drew from the ratification session on the 13th day, citing a need to consult internal advisors on provisions they had previously indicated they found acceptable. The withdrawal was not explained publicly. The Compact's internal documentation from that period contains a record of the senior diplomatic staff's deliberations, which I have also read, and which I will summarize in 1 sentence. The Compact's senior staff concluded, by unanimous consent in a session that lasted less than 40 minutes, that the corridor question was no longer a viable strategic objective, and that the appropriate course was to withdraw from the current negotiation without explanation, and to allow the matter to recede from the Compact's active agenda indefinitely. The word indefinitely appears in the meeting's summary notes. It was underlined in the documentary convention of the Compact's administrative culture, signified that the underlined word was being used in its strongest available sense. They did not mean for a long time. They meant they did not intend to return to the question. They did not return to it. I want to say something now about what it is to read a file like this, because I think it is relevant to why I keep reading it, and why I have spent 38 years in a cold vault that most of my colleagues consider a posting to be endured rather than sought. An archive like this one, the Tier 7 restricted stacks, the sealed incident files, the deep files, is not a place where history is stored. History is stored on the public floors. What is stored here is the part of history that the parties involved chose not to release into the general record. The reasons for that choice are varied, but they share a common element. Someone, at some point, at a piece of documentation and decided that the world was safer, or at least more stable, with that documentation in a vault than without it. That judgment may have been right or wrong. I am not in the business of reversing it. Function is to preserve what has been sealed, and to maintain access controls, and to conduct periodic reviews that confirm the material remains as it was when it was sealed. But I am also a historian by training, and a historian in a vault full of sealed files cannot help doing what historians do, connecting the available evidence into patterns, identifying the shape of things behind what the documents explicitly say, reading the negative space, the struck-through sentences, the one-day retirement approvals, the marginal notations in a second handwriting that say did not ask, good. The pattern I have assembled, over 11 readings of file VETH 7414, is not a narrative I can prove in the strict evidentiary sense. The sealed survey report tells me what the corridor contained when it was traversable again. It does not tell me what it contained during the 11 days it was not. The Compact's internal logs tell me when the human attendant returned. and in what condition the chief of protocol found them. They do not tell me where the human attendant was for 11 days, or what the human attendant did, or what the human attendant thought about any of it. What I have is the corridor, 11 days, empty. The Vrethian Governing Compact's position on humanity was documented extensively across 40 internal papers spanning 11 years. After the assembly, I could find no additional documentation of that position. Not a revision of it, not a formal retraction, no documentation at all. The Strategic Assessment Division produced, in the 8 months following the assembly, 73 papers on subjects ranging from border policy to agricultural trade protocols. None of them addressed the position on humanity. None of them addressed the corridor. None of them addressed the assembly or its outcome. The division continued operating, continued producing documentation, and simply never returned to the question it had spent 11 years developing a considered position on. This is the kind of absence that is not nothing. I have read documentation of many governing bodies that revised their positions on humanity over the centuries this archive covers. Some of them revised their positions in the conventional way: a formal policy review, a new assessment document, a communique to allied bodies explaining the change in strategic calculus. This is what deliberate institutional change looks like, and I have extensive examples of it in the stacks. What the compact did was different. They did not revise their position. They did not retract it. They simply never mentioned it again. The position sat in their archive documentation, unchanged, while the institution that had produced it quietly organized its subsequent behavior on the assumption that the position was no longer operative, without ever saying so, without ever providing a reason, without ever producing the kind of document that would formally close the chapter. The chapter was closed. It was closed without paperwork. In an institution as thoroughly documented as the Vrethian Governing Compact, an absence of paperwork is the loudest possible statement. Now I want to tell you about the line I added to the file. It is the only unauthorized addition to any document in the Tier 7 restricted stacks. I know this because I review the stacks regularly, and because it is the only addition I have made, and I am the only person with the access level required to make it. The line is in my handwriting, at the bottom of the file's summary page, in the space below the conclave's official receipt notation and the date of original sealing. It is written in the marginal note convention of the conclave's historical records, the small hand used for annotations that are not part of the original document, but are considered part of the archival record of the document's handling. I added it on the morning after my third reading of the file, approximately 6 years into my tenure. I have not removed it. No review board has instructed me to remove it. 3 senior adjudicators have, over the years, reviewed the stacks as part of standard administrative oversight and encountered the notation. None of them asked me about it. One of them, during a routine review session, sat with the file for a long time before returning it to the shelf and leaving the stacks without comment. She requested reassignment to the cataloging division 2 months later. She had been the most senior adjudicator in the conclave's record preservation hierarchy, with 19 years remaining before mandatory retirement age. She has not, to my knowledge, returned to the Tier 7 level since. The line I added reads as follows. Note for subsequent archivists. The corridor's relay stations recorded nothing, and this is the correct record. I have been asked on one occasion what I meant by it. The question came from the conclave's current director of records, encountered my notation during a comprehensive audit she was conducting personally, rather than delegating, as directors sometimes do when they want to assess a sensitive matter without involving junior staff. She sat with the file for some time. Then she looked at my notation. Then she looked at me. I told her that I meant what I had written, that the relay stations had recorded nothing for 11 days, that this was factually accurate, that the factual accuracy of a sealed report's contents was not a matter of interpretation. She asked me if that was the entire reason for the notation. I told her that what I had written was what I had written, and that I did not intend to add to it, and that if she wished to instruct me to remove it, she had the authority to do so, and I would comply. She did not instruct me to remove it. She did not speak to me again during that audit, which lasted 2 more days. When the audit was complete, She filed her report, which I reviewed as part of the standard administrative process, and which contained no mention of my notation. I do not know whether this was an oversight, a deliberate omission, or a considered judgment that the notation was within the scope of an archivist's professional discretion. I have not asked. The corridor still runs between the two regions of administered space. Ships transit it regularly. The trade protocols the Seventh Solvith Economic Agreement established are still in effect, with subsequent amendments, 4 generations after the assembly. The Vrethian Governing Compact still exists, in a reduced and somewhat altered form, reduced in the way that governing bodies are reduced when they quietly reorganize their ambitions around a smaller perimeter than the one they began with. Over decades of low-intensity accommodation with the political landscape they find themselves in. I do not believe the current leadership of the Compact has access to the documentation I have described here. I believe those documents exist in the Compact's own sealed archives, under access restrictions that have by now outlasted everyone who set them. I believe this because the current leadership of the Compact, in the public statements and policy documents I have reviewed as part of my ongoing professional obligation to monitor the broader galactic context that gives the files in my care their meaning, displays no particular awareness of the question at all. They have a functioning economy. They have territorial management concerns of their own. They have the standard institutional anxieties of a mid-sized governing body in a sector with more players than resources. They do not, in any document I have reviewed, say anything about human space. They do not say anything about what the Galaxaki does or does not fear. They do not produce strategic assessments of the avoidance designations that older species maintain. They do not, in other words, display any of the energetic and considered skepticism that their predecessors documented so carefully across 40 papers and 11 years. I do not know what the current Compact's leaders know about their own history. I know what their predecessors decided to document and what they decided not to document, and I know that the silence in the documentation is the loudest part. This is what I think about sometimes in the cold. I think about the Chief of Protocol's notation. Did not ask. Good. I think about the captain's struck-through sentence in the survey report, the one they wrote and then decided not to file. I think about the Strategic Assessment Division's 73 papers on agricultural trade protocols and border management, filed in the 8 months after the assembly, in which the word humanity does not appear. I think about the senior adjudicator who read the file and requested reassignment. I think about what it means to be a species that the galaxy has learned, over generations, to treat as a category, not a diplomatic partner, not a military threat in the conventional sense, not the kind that is assessed and countered and eventually accommodated. A category, the kind of thing for which other governing bodies have a file designation, a clearance level, a cold vault, and an archivist with progressive joint deterioration who goes back to the same shelf every 7 or 8 years when the world starts. Produce new institutions that have not yet learned what the old ones knew. I think about the relay stations. Their logs for those 11 days exist in the sealed survey report. I have read them. The captain was accurate, not incomplete entries, not corrupted entries. The relay stations were recording. There is no record of what they recorded. The system functioned as designed and produced no output for 11 days, and then resumed producing output as normal on the 12th day, and the output it produced on the 12th day showed a corridor that contained empty space and functional infrastructure, and nothing else. I think about the word unremarkable in the Chief of Protocol's log entry. I think about what the protocol officers' training and instruments were calibrated to detect, and I think about what was not within the scope of those calibrations. And I think about what unremarkable means when the instrument of measurement has a specific and bounded range. I think sometimes about the human. I do not have a face for them, or a voice, any detail beyond attendant staff and a registration identifier, and one protocol officer's notation that their condition, on return, required no medical intervention. I think about what it would be to be one person sent into a corridor as a demonstration of contempt, as evidence that another governing body found the thing you represented so unremarkable that, They would use you as a prop in a diplomatic performance, as staff, as furniture in the room where the negotiations happened. Think about what that person did or did not think about that arrangement. I think about whether they understood what the compact was doing, and, if they did understand, what they felt about it. I think about whether, without significant objection, meant they did not find the arrangement prizing. I think about what it would mean to belong to a species that the galaxy had spent enough generations fearing that an individual member, here, we would like to use you as evidence that you are not frightening and find this unremarkable. I think about 11 days. I think about what 11 days looks like from inside a corridor that no vessel traverses, and no communication crosses, and no instrument records. I think about the relay stations that were recording and produced no record. I think about what that means in terms of what the relay stations encountered, whether no record is a failure of the record-keeping system, or a faithful record of what the system detected, which was a corridor in which nothing it was calibrated to detect was present. Do not arrive at conclusions I can document. That is not what this kind of thinking is for. What I arrive at every time is the notation I wrote on the file's summary page. The relay stations recorded nothing, and this is the correct record. The file is sealed. It will remain sealed as long as the conclave maintains the designation, which I have recommended, in each of my 4-cycle formal reviews, be maintained without amendment. My recommendations have been accepted each time without challenge. I expect they will continue to be accepted. The conclave has accumulated, over its operational history, a particular kind of institutional wisdom about which files should stay closed and which should not. And that wisdom does not always express itself through explicit directives. Sometimes it expresses itself through the quiet administrative consensus that some things are better in the vault. I go to the shelf, sometimes, when the cold has been in the joints for too long, and I need to move, and I stand in front of it, to open it. I have opened it enough times to know what is inside, iced in front of it, the way one stands in front of a window in a room one has lived in for a long time, not to look through it, but because the act of being in front of it is itself a kind of orientation, a reminder of what the room contains and what lies outside it. The file stands alone. There is sufficient space on either side of it that no one reaching for a neighboring folder would brush its edge by accident. Intend to maintain that space. I intend to pass the instruction on, when the time comes, to whoever holds this posting after me, verbally, as my predecessor passed it to me, without a written directive, with only the professional courtesy of one archivist to the next. I think they will understand when they read the file. The corridor still runs. Ships transit it. The relay stations record everything that moves through them, every day, without interruption. That is the correct record. The Compact's 40 papers on humanity are in the archive where they have always been. They have not been revised. They have not been retracted. They sit in the sealed documentation of an institution that produced them and then quietly organized its subsequent life around the understanding that they were no longer operative, without ever saying so, without ever explaining why. Some files stay closed because the people who sealed them feared what was inside. Some files stay closed because the people who came after them learned, through indirect and largely undocumented means, to share that judgment. This is one of those files. I am the third archivist to hold this posting. I have been here for 38 years. I do not plan to request reassignment. The cold has been in the joints for long enough, now that I know it will not leave. The cold has also been in the joints long enough that I have learned to work with it rather than against it. It keeps you present. The cold. It keeps you careful. It prevents the kind of comfortable drift into abstraction that warmer rooms sometimes permit. In a cold room, you stay close to what is in front of you. You stay close to the record. The record is a corridor, 4 light years, 11 days, empty. Record is one individual, attendant staff, condition unremarkable, no medical intervention required. The record is a notation in the margin, in a second handwriting, 4 words. Did not ask. Good. These are the facts in the file. I have held them for 38 years. I will hold them until I am no longer able to hold them. Then I will pass the file and the shelf, and the space around the shelf, to whoever comes next. And I will tell them, as I was told, that they will understand when they read it. They will understand.